I'm an adventurer. Granted, this is a self-proclaimed title, as there is no adventurer certificate, diploma, or even a box to mark on your driver's license application. Now, I seriously doubt that I am your stereotypical image of an adventurer. Big, strong, and physically intimidating to polar bears. Quite the contrary. I'm only physically intimidating to a few skittish cats and maybe some Labrador puppies. Nor do I buy into the macho bravado of I'm fearless. Oddly enough, my fears of being struck by lightning while flying or eaten by sharks while swimming are completely counter to the story that I've come to share with you today. Now, my adventure began on New Year's Day 2015 as I boarded a plane for Japan with a one-way airline ticket. I intended to come back to the United States, but by a less conventional method. Now, a typical return from Tokyo to Los Angeles in the comfort of an Airbus 380 requires about 12 hours of flight time. For my mode of aerial transportation, it was going to take a lot longer, be less predictable, and added levels of danger one would not experience seated in row 56, seat D. My return across the ocean would be achieved by floating through the sky in a helium-filled balloon. Think of the movie Up. This is the stuff of children's dreams and Jules Verne novels. It is a very simple aircraft. Drop ballast overboard, typically in the form of sand, and you go higher. Open a valve in the top of the balloon to let a little helium out, and you go lower. The idea is to use these two finite resources, helium and sand, in order to navigate to a suitable landing site prior to depleting one or either of them completely. Now, because of the simplicity of this aircraft, there's the complexity of how do you get it to go where you want it to go? Well, there is no engine on a balloon, so our only means of propulsion is the wind. And the wind will vary in direction and speed at various altitudes through the atmosphere. So our job with being able to go up or down is to find a wind that meets our needs on track and speed to meet our goal. So the large helium-filled balloon is what gave us our lift, the wind is what propelled us along, and this small, lightweight capsule would provide our housing for the entire journey. Now, the forklift is there to give you an idea as to the relative size of this capsule. The interior dimensions of this capsule were about half the size of this red carpet that I'm standing on right now. So imagine living in this space for an entire week with someone else. So it definitely redefines the term close friends. But my close friend and co-pilot for this odyssey was Leonid Tuktayev from Russia. Now inside the capsule you can see the interior dimensions don't give a lot of privacy. However, it did protect us from the elements, and it housed everything that would be required for our week-long camping trip in the air. We had food, water, a heater, satellite phones, navigation equipment, and so you don't lose track on this talk, we also had a very nice plastic-lined bucket. So this project took years of planning and a lot of patience on waiting for the right weather. But once Mother Nature finally provided the right weather pattern for a trans-Pacific attempt, Leonid and I were ready. We inflated our balloon with helium, we loaded our equipment, and we launched from the south of Japan in a town called Saga. Now, the first 12 hours or so, we flew along the mainland of Japan, going from Saga up towards Tokyo. And from the very beginning, the bird's eye views with this aerial perch were absolutely stunning. An absolutely amazing flight throughout. By sunset, we were passing actually by Mount Fuji. And a few hours later, we were 20,000 feet above the ground looking down on the lights of Tokyo. As we left the security of land that night, with North America thousands of miles downwind, there was a sense of the daunting task that was in front of us. Because in a balloon, the only way to travel is downwind. So, unlike a mountain climbing expedition that runs into bad weather, there is no returning to base camp or waiting for the weather to improve. We have one shot with no turning back, and failure truly was not an option. Now, we didn't set out to conquer the Pacific by balloon. We set out to work in harmony with Mother Nature, hoping she would allow us to cross this massive expanse of beauty. But as beautiful as it is also a hostile and unforgiving environment, from our flight altitudes that required supplemental oxygen to the churning ocean below. As a matter of fact, our search and rescue specialist said that if we were to go down in the North Pacific, it could potentially take days to get a ship to our last known position. And even then, it wouldn't be finding a needle in a haystack. It would be finding a needle in a field full of haystacks. So this definitely put the dangers and possible consequences of our flight into perspective. But as we continued to move eastward, we weren't guided by a blind faith. We actually had a command center set up here in Albuquerque, manned 24 hours a day. It was like a NASA mission. So these guys are doing everything to give us all the information that we could possibly need with flight data and changes in the weather to help us get across. So as we were propelled on this invisible conveyor of wind, the trick was to move fast enough to not allow bad weather to catch us, but to move slow enough to not catch bad weather in front of us. And the window in between these two was very tiny. It required a lot of precision flying. At this point, Leonid and I were very far removed from the rest of the world, but we quickly adapted to our new surroundings and actually began to form daily routines. And one of our rituals was, for every 10 degrees of longitude that we traveled, we'd split a chocolate bar. Now, to give you an idea, on our track, the Pacific is about 1/3 the circumference of the Earth, or 10 to 12 chocolate bars across. So as our chocolate bar supply dwindled, our hopes success rose. So it is hard to imagine how small you feel as day after day you know that you're moving towards land, but the horizon of water is seemingly endless in all directions. The GPS lets you know that you're moving forward by the numbers, but you don't feel it because you're part of the wind. So hour after hour, day after day, as we were trekking forward across the Pacific in a beautiful flight, there was no engine to disrupt the silence and the solitude. So if heaven is standing on a cloud, we had arrived. As we peacefully floated along, day after day, eating a chocolate bar or two, our meteorologist was tasked with looking at the weather models, updating his forecast, and then relaying that information to us. So his job was to develop a strategy to find the best winds to get us towards our target of getting across the ocean. And a typical text from him might say something like, for the next 6 hours, you need to be at 16,000 feet in order to achieve being at this location later. If not, we'll need to adjust your altitude. So it was kind of like playing a game of three-dimensional chess with Mother Nature. And as we went into our 7th day of flying, it was her move, and she began to stir it up a little bit here. About that time, relatively close to our position, on the Baja of Mexico in a small surfing village, there was a tourist that blogged on his website that said the night before there had been a heavy rainstorm with a lot of thunder and lightning, and he had nightmares through the night of the ocean rising and his RV actually floating away. So now I'm sure it was a very unsettling night for him. However, as he was having a restless night sleeping, I was watching the same intense storm from my vantage point. North of the storm, 18,000 feet above the Pacific, dangling from a balloon. Now, one of my worst fears is thunderstorms. And here I was close enough to see the contour of every cloud when the lightning illuminated the sky. Our target was the Mexican Baja, and the target of the storm that we paralleled was the same. It was like coincidentally running into your worst enemy in the checkout line. It's a terrible situation, very uncomfortable, you know it won't last forever, but still, not a fun deal to go through. So fortunately, through that night, we never got close enough to the storm to create any Wizard of Oz flying house moments, but it still was a very long, stressful, sleepless night. But in the morning, just before the daybreak, the storm began to dissipate off in the distance. So we began to valve off copious amounts of helium in order to decrease our lift and initiate our descent towards the Mexican coastline. All of the weather models were indicating that we should be continuing in an eastwardly direction as we got lower. However, as we continued to drop lower and lower, the winds began to shift 90 degrees to the south and actually paralleling us along the coast. So we were out of ballast. We didn't have the opportunity to be able to go to a higher altitude to correct for this. But as we got lower, we noticed that the sea was relatively calm and our capsule was built to float. So we chose to make a water landing 4 miles off of the coast of Mexico. Now, there is a reason that I'm a pilot and not a sailor. Namely, I have a strong propensity for seasickness. So as we bobbed around in the sea with our capsule on its side, awaiting rescue, I was turning pale, paler, and reliving my last few meals on board. But thankfully, not long after we had landed, we were rescued by a group of very entertained Mexican fishermen. They were looking for shrimp, and instead they caught an American, a Russian, and a balloon. So who's going to believe their fishing story, right? Well, I was seasick, sleep deprived, and 7 days, no showers, smelly. I was also the happiest I had ever been in my life. Our remarkable journey across the world's largest body of water had taken us nearly 6,700 miles in 160 hours, breaking the distance records and their duration records for gas balloons. Now, very few people can identify with a transoceanic balloon flight, but we can all identify with fear. And our flight incorporated some of the most widely held and obvious fears there are: fear of death, flying, heights, lightning, falling, drowning, the dark, enclosed spaces, the unknown, failure, and now, public speaking. So, almost everyone can identify with one or many of the fears that we had to address. However, once we put aside the perceived dangers and figured out how to deal with the real dangers, we knew we were ready for our adventure. Because you see, fear can paralyze or prompt you. It doesn't decide, you do. And by taking a very calculated, risk-mitigating approach, we actually had an enjoyable journey and a successful adventure. Now, we all have personal and maybe professional bucket lists of things that we hope to achieve. And I hope that when you start checking off those bucket list items, that you take the self-proclaimed title of adventurer, use your fears to prompt action, and enjoy the journey. Isn't that what life is all about?